Well, good day, friends. Welcome to Faith Seeking Understanding. I am Alan Bevere, your host. I am a pastor, retired, a professor, a Bible moth, a theologian in exile, and a peddler of hope. And I'm watching the snow right outside the window of
Ooh,
my
nice.
study. I'm not happy, but that's okay because there's always hope. Spring is coming. I am
Yes.
the self-appointed Anselm of Canterbury, chair of podcast theology and culture here at Faith Seeking Understanding University, a completely fabricated institution of higher learning, but one where all seekers are invited to ponder profound things. And I have with me the one, only unique Michael, and he has the fingerprints to prove it, Cruz. And he is the professor of economics, the Grand Poobah professor of
Bebop professor,
economics.
yes.
I keep forgetting you have an endowed chair with no money. The Grand Poobah chair of economics
The
and
story of my life.
public, yeah, exactly. Public theology here at Faith Seeking Understanding University. Michael, how are you today?
I'm doing great. And
Good.
I know that spring is coming because baseball players are showing up in
Oh, two
Arizona.
weeks, less than two
Yes.
weeks.
So,
Pitchers and catchers report. I mean, that is for
yeah,
me a sign of spring.
it is.
It is, and
It's here.
I'm excited. I think the Guardians will be contenders for the playoffs this year, and
Yeah.
we'll see. We'll see how that
Our
goes.
Royals are hoping to.
Yeah.
We're hoping to defeat your optimism. So,
Yeah, I
yes.
understand that. Yeah, we're in the same division. Yeah, it sort of creates some problems, but yeah.
Yep.
Um, anyway, yeah, I'm excited. For the
Yeah.
greatest sport ever invented to start, and so
It'll be
anyway,
good.
football season is over after this Sunday. I think the Seahawks are the team to beat.
I think so. Yeah.
They are
Yeah.
so all around just solid.
All aspects of the game. Yep.
Yeah. So anyway, and I'm kind of pulling for them anyway. I mean, I don't have a dog in that race, but
Me neither.
I'm kind of pulling for them because the Patriots, they win all the time. And
Right.
although you got to say, after losing Belichick and Tom
Yeah.
Brady, it only took them a couple years or so to get back to the Super Bowl. I mean, that's impressive.
Yeah, it's been a pretty impressive rebuild. So
Yeah,
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 yeah, yeah. Something the Browns don't know about are impressive rebuilds. Yeah, that's escaped us. So anyway. All
yeah,
right. Well, that's another story. Anyway,
yes,
all right.
yeah,
So today, a little bit of a
yes,
departure from what we normally do, but I think it's important because I do think it's still timely for today. Ken Burns, who recently produced a six-part documentary on the American Revolution. I tell people that I just think Ken Burns is an American treasure.
yeah,
He has probably been the one person who has made American history accessible and interesting in our time with all of the documentaries he's made. And I remember back in the early 90s when he made the Civil War, which is what put him on the map. He was told by everybody, you can't make an interesting documentary like this on the Civil War. There's no videos, you don't have any
right,
eyewitnesses, and the photos are black and white. And he went and did it, and it was great.
yeah, yeah,
And so now he's done the revolution with no photos,
yeah. He has even less material to work with
right?
here. Yeah, yeah.
And boy, Michael, I thought it was really great.
I did too. I did
Yeah.
too. It's a complicated story, but
Oh my
he
gosh, it is
pulled it
complicated. And
together.
and
Yeah,
this is what we want to talk about because I like the way
yeah,
he does that. As well as I do, history is complex. There's a
yeah.
complexity to it, and there's always the temptation, and I suppose it's the human temptation to want to simplify everything, to make it to make it graspable.
Right,
Human beings, we do tend to be uncomfortable with ambiguity, so we want to kind of simplify the story. What I love about Burns is he doesn't do that. He tells it from different
right,
angles. And
right.
I'm going to I've got some quotes here that we're going to kind of jump off in conversation. But one of the things that strikes me about this is that one of the comments that was made was that in some ways the revolution was more of a civil war than the Civil War.
Yeah. Right.
because you had, in the Civil War, you had North versus South. We were divided regionally. Yes, there were tensions even within those regions, but in the Revolutionary War, you had really divided communities.
Yeah.
Right there. So you didn't have, you had Massachusetts, which was kind of a hotbed for revolution. South Carolina in the beginning was tepid toward the idea. But these communities, local, I mean, your neighbor, right?
Yeah.
You could be a patriot, your neighbors could be Tories. I mean, it
Yeah.
was just it was kind of a factional war in some ways.
Yeah. Yeah. One of my ancestors is a gentleman named Theophilus Cotton. He was a colonel at the beginning of the Revolutionary War from Plymouth, Massachusetts, and head of the militia there. Marshfield, which is the town, neighboring town, was a Tory stronghold, and they were sent to march on Marshfield. And basically, he took his troops to the edge, but hesitated to go in to give them time to evacuate.
Yeah.
These are people who knew each other. I mean,
Yeah.
so he gave them time to evacuate, so to minimize the bloodshed. And then
Mm.
once they took that town, then they were on to Boston and to deal with the issues there. But yeah, these were neighbors who knew neighbors,
Yeah.
and it was and I thought it did a really good job of the series did a really good job of emphasizing that, and some of the cruelty and the dehumanization of each
Yeah.
other
Yeah.
in the middle of that battle.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. In the atrocities that were committed on both sides,
Yeah.
where, people who had the unfortunate luck of being on the wrong side of whatever community they were in, had their
Right.
property confiscated,
Yeah.
and run out of town. Some of them were killed. Um,
Right.
Lots of tensions running real high at that point. So
Yeah.
it was a pretty messy thing.
And
Violence
I
and
think
war are always messy.
yeah. I think one of the parallels, kind of a subtopic, but just based on where I live, Kansas City area, um, I was thinking about in the Civil War, so much of the war and what we think of as the Civil War occurring in the major battlefields with largely northern states that were very heavily pro-union and at least not in favor of slavery. Whether they were thoroughly motivated by that, and that's another question for some people, but very much have one view. You had a regional difference in the South where you had two regional factions that were fighting each other, but not high levels of conflict internally in the North or internally in the South. They were
Right.
fighting another region. In our area here in Kansas City, we literally had neighbor versus neighbor burning down each other's homes, vigilante groups going back and forth. And as they described some of this stuff in the Revolutionary War, I just kept thinking back to all the stories that I've grown up with about what happened in Kansas City
Yeah.
during and just before the Civil War. Is a very they called it Bleeding Kansas,
Yeah.
and it was a very similar kind of thing. I think it's probably the more typical type of Civil War that happens.
Yeah. Yeah. It was pretty
People,
bad. John Brown
yeah,
comes out of there, right?
there you go. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
So,
Yeah,
wow. Well, so let me start with I've got some quotes here from the
yeah,
movie, from the documentary, and we'll just kind of use this as a jumping off point. But
right,
one of the things right at the beginning in episode one, one of the quotes that I just think is worth pointing out, and it highlights the complexity. Uh, the narrator says, long before 13 British colonies made themselves into the United States, the Six Nations of the Iroquois Confederacy had created a union of their own that they called the Haudenosaunee, a democracy that had flourished for centuries.
right,
We do not emphasize enough the role that the indigenous folks,
right,
as well as slaves, played here, and that we treat so one of the things that I remember, so when I was a young seminary student, I remember reading an account of the Constitutional Convention of 1787, right? When everybody gathers
Yeah.
together in Philadelphia to hammer out a constitution. And one of the things, the points that the book made that just stuck with me was that the delegates at the Constitutional Convention, one of the great concerns is how do you administrate all this, what they think is empty land, right? They're
Yes.
thinking west, right? They're
Yeah.
thinking
Right. Yeah.
west. How do we administrate all this empty land? Well, it's not empty,
Yeah. Right.
right?
Yeah.
But that's how they're thinking about this,
There's your
right?
first problem.
And so we just tend to think that this is about Americans, meaning European Americans, and British, who are fighting in the war. But we've got all kinds of indigenous folks
Right.
um, who basically are throwing their fortunes uh, after the side that they think is going to prevail. They
Right.
they understandably don't have any big concern about whether it's the British or the Americans who prevail. They just want
Right.
to make sure they're on the winning side
Exactly. Yeah.
because
Right.
their future depends upon it.
Right. Yeah. Which is true in almost every major conflict where there are the subplot players.
Yeah.
Very often, what the issue is which side's gonna prevail in building coalitions
Yeah.
with those. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, so and what they do matters. I mean, what sides they fight on matters. They tell several different stories about this
right.
and the importance of it. And of course, it doesn't matter who would have won, even if the British had prevailed. The indigenous folks would come out on the losing end.
Yes. Right.
I think that was already looking like that was going to happen eventually. So.
Right. Yeah.
But at the time, they're just working to survive as a people, which is what any of us would do.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
So again, the complexity of this, um, and I mean, we'll talk about slavery in a little bit. But the other thing that was mentioned in the film was that our founding is interesting. Rick Atkinson, who is one of the commentators, one of the guys they interview, says that our founding is and I found this as a biblical guy, I found this interesting. It's our creation myth. It's our
Yes.
creation story. It tells us who we
Right.
are, he says, where we came from, what our forebears believed, and what they were willing to die for. That's the most profound question any people can ask themselves. It needs to be said, and I know we don't like to think this way, but the reality is any people, any group, any organization, we have mythology.
Yes. Right.
And mythology, the word mythos is in Greek, is sacred story. Now,
Right.
sometimes those sacred stories are true. I would
Right.
argue the sacred story of the resurrection of Jesus is true, but there
Right.
are also sacred stories that are not true or that are selectively told.
Right. Yes. Right.
And that is again what I think is great about this series is that obviously you can't tell every angle on history, no matter how
Right.
detailed you are. But he tries to tell it from sort of a 360-degree view, right?
Right.
As
Right.
opposed to just some narrow view. But there is a lot of creation mythology. By the way, which I would argue, and I think you'll agree,
Yeah.
is part of the problem we have right now in our context, is that we have people wanting to reassert themselves to tell a mythology about us that's been told to
Right.
exclude certain people, and
Right.
that's been reasserting itself in
Right.
recent years.
Yes. That they feel their power diminishing, their narrative is weakening, and so this is a last ditch attempt to revive that narrative, to reimpose that narrative.
Yeah.
I think it's ultimately unsuccessful, but that is I think what's happening on the topic of that, just as a story within a story about the American Revolution. Most people don't realize that Plymouth Rock was not a thing until the Revolution. And
Oh,
one
I
of the
didn't know
reasons,
that.
yes, the Plymouth Rock was inconsequential. Nobody knew anything about it. And just to the time before the Revolution, as all this was developing, there were some elders that were had raised the story about where Plymouth Rock had been built. And again, going back to the same ancestor I was referring to, Theophilus Cotton, he was the one who and he wasn't alone, but he was the one who championed this idea. Was that Plymouth Rock was the symbol of people coming for liberty and freedom to the United States, and so they hauled Plymouth Rock up out of the off the water and into the town and made it this big emblem. And there was a battle back and forth between whether Plymouth Rock should be seen as our founding narrative or maybe Jamestown, which was a much more sort of a mercantilist economic adventure versus Plymouth, which was they were casting as people seeking religious freedom and
Yeah.
seeking liberty, that type of thing. And so they made it a symbol of liberty. Well, anybody who knows the whole story about Plymouth Rock and what happened with Plymouth and the founding is a much more complicated
It
story
is.
than
Yeah.
that. But the mythology is what where that came from
Yeah.
in the time of the Revolution. So there are many myths mythos that begins around the time of the revolution and founding our country. Yeah,
Yeah. 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 We've got to have those stories that make sense of us and that give us something to be proud of. That's it's hard to look at the difficult uh, times of our history and understandably so. But obviously, a serious historian says, "Hey, folks, we got to look at all this stuff."
right.
One of the things is I grew up being taught in school, and so were you, that people came here for religious freedom, which was true. There were people, dissenters and others, who came for
Right.
religious freedom. What I wasn't taught was that they, in turn, didn't want to offer religious freedom to others,
Yes.
right?
Right. Yes. Yes.
So freedom for me, but not for thee. So,
Right.
so
Yeah.
we don't tell that other part of the story because it gets in the way of the mythology.
Yeah. Some of my ancestors in Massachusetts Bay Colony that came there for religious freedom executed Mary Dyer because she was a Quaker missionary, and they didn't want
Yeah,
the Quakers there. So
yeah,
yeah, so religious freedom. Yeah, so it's a more complicated story than the myth develops. From going to my social science background, one of the things that I heard years ago, which has always stuck with me, and it was an anthropologist actually I was listening to at one point, was talking about the origins of language and
yeah,
talking about our developing of stories, and that stories. His belief was is that our stories did not develop in order for us to be able to convey the truth to each other.
yeah,
Stories developed in order for us to develop social cohesion
yeah.
around a shared narrative of what was happening, and that reinforced our importance to the diminishment of the importance of those things that would threaten our importance,
Right.
and that has continued on through human history. That tends to be what storytelling is about. But as Christians and people who are devoted to God and the image of God being in all people, that then puts a challenge to those narratives. That those narratives have to be evaluated in the light of that revealed word that we've given from God. Yeah,
Right. Exactly right. That's exactly right.
yeah,
Um, the other thing that sort of comes out, I think that's related to that because it relates, if it relates to the complexity of people and where they're coming from, it relates also to social status. And they
right,
talk about Washington, who is a colonel in the militia, in the Virginia militia, and he's on behalf of the king. He actually is the one who probably starts the French and Indian War. That's his claim to
yeah,
fame.
right, yeah,
Um, but
right,
after this is all over, he wants to get a commission in the British Army, which is the regular commission, and he's denied it
right,
because he's not British. And he
right.
he gets a taste of
Yes,
that kind of prejudice, and so he ends up resigning his commission. And Joseph Ellis, who is a Washington historian, says When Washington is told that he didn't get a commission, he doesn't think that means he's inferior. He thinks that means the British are really stupid.
Yeah.
And
Right. Yep.
uh,
Yep.
but it does lend credence to the fact that the American aristocracy, as they viewed
Yes.
themselves, were not viewed that way from the British perspective,
Exactly.
right?
Right. Yeah. Right.
And so one of the stories too is there's a whole lot of caste and social status narrative going on. The British tended to uh, choose their officers from the gentry because they thought the gentry, was smarter or more intelligent, that kind of thing. And there were some terrible generals in the British Army
Right.
uh, because it wasn't about qualification; it was about status.
Right.
So these kinds of things just seem to be present all throughout the revolution.
Right. Well, there's a book. It's probably, I don't know, 60, 70 years old now. A guy named Carl Degler. I think it's called Out of Our Past. I think it is, and he just talks about um, ways that things developed differently in the American colonies than what they were developing in
Yeah,
England from that period of the early foundings in the 1600s up until the time of the Revolution. No intentional attempt to change things, but just like the idea that in England you only could vote if you were a landowner. So it was restricted to a very narrow number of people that could vote. But when you get to Massachusetts and the colonies, you have 60, 70, 80% of the people own some land. And so they're able to vote. And this sort of idea of universal suffrage just sort of begins to happen serendipitously, not because of any particular movement to create it, but
right.
it's there. The idea of you have a legislature that could develop within a colony, but then the king would appoint his viceroy or governor over that colony, which then led to an adversarial relationship often between the legislature and the executive branch, which you didn't have so much in much of English history. I mean, there were times obviously where it did, but the idea was that the two were more entwined with each other. And
Right.
so we had all these things that developed over 150 years. American culture and its sense of governance and identity of itself had it had taken a different route than England had, but England was still behaving as though they should behave as English people do. Uh,
Yeah.
and uh, and so the American Revolution actually becomes a conservative revolution to preserve the things that Americans think that they've developed that they value, as
Yeah.
opposed to more like the French Revolution, the liberal revolution, where they're trying to overturn something and create something new. They were trying to preserve what they thought was their birthright.
Yeah, it's interesting because there is a point somewhere in the documentary early on, and I can't remember where there's somebody who's been quoted who basically says, basically is we've always governed ourselves,
Yes,
right?
right,
So that even though they've answered to the crown, loyal to the crown, they got to do stuff that the crown wants them to do and things like that. In a sense, functionally, these colonies are governing themselves.
right.
And
And they had been.
and so it's a
They've
way
largely
to
been
preserve,
ignored.
yeah, it's a way to
Yeah,
preserve what's already happened. One of the things you talked about land in Massachusetts. So there's two things that come to my mind with that. The first is uh, the debate later on after Washington is president and you get Adams and Jefferson in that you have a debate as to who should vote, right? And
right.
in Massachusetts, like you say, you've got 70%, 80% who own land and are voting.
Yeah,
So there's actually an argument. Adams and Jefferson. Jefferson is becoming more and more of the opinion that voting should be wider, that more
yeah.
people should be allowed to vote. Of course, he's got white men in mind. Obviously, he doesn't have
Right.
anyone
Yes.
else in
Yeah.
mind.
Right.
But
Right.
extending it to more white men, whereas Adams is more of an elitist and he's got concerns
Yes.
about this, right?
Right.
I
Yeah.
mean, and he's got
The
concerns
riffraff
that you
and
let
things.
stupid people vote. Now,
Yeah.
in fairness to Adams, I mean, you can't police democracy like that. We know that. You
Right.
can't. I've always said that the great thing about democracy is we allow people to uh, have a voice and vote. And the terrible thing about democracy is we allow people to have a voice and vote. Because the
Right.
reality is we let stupid people vote. Okay?
Right.
That's what we
Right.
do. So Adams has got, I think Adams has a sense of the problem here, but ultimately Jefferson wins out. And I think that's probably
Yeah,
the way it should be in a democracy. So that's
yeah,
the first thing. The second thing is that in the documentary, they show a map that's drawn. Uh, it's drawn. I want to say it's either it must be before the Revolution. It's drawn, but you've got Virginia, North Carolina, and these Pennsylvania, these colonies that are being drawn, and the maps, the boundaries are just going all the way out
yeah,
west, right?
right. Yeah,
And not
gotcha.
stopping.
Yeah,
When those colonies don't control any of that land.
yeah,
So
right.
from the beginning, there
Yeah,
is this belief in expansion.
yeah, right.
They quote Maggie Blackhawk in the film, and she says she's talking about this map, and she says maps at the time show the colonies extending well into the interior. We often see maps as benign, as descriptive, as without argument, but they're aspirational in many ways. They're an argument rather than a conclusion.
Yeah, that's a
And
good
I
quote.
think
Yeah,
about the fact that in every map I saw growing up, North America, the United States, is right in the center part of the global map.
right. Yeah, right.
It's not
Yes,
Africa,
right.
right?
Yeah,
It's
right.
North America. So
Northern
um,
Hemisphere with U.S. in the middle. Yep.
that's right. So at the right beginning, there's this idea of what later becomes known as manifest destiny that this land is for us to take.
Yeah, right. Yeah,
George Washington saw this too, but I mean, he talks about the future that with all the land that they're looking at, talking about America becoming just prosperous. And I think one of the
right.
things I have a book sitting on my shelf that I have yet to read, but I need to read it.
Yeah,
Um, and it's called Prisoners of Geography, and it's about how geography is destiny,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
And basically here you've got all this land
yeah,
that no colony in Europe, I mean, once the Americans get control of all of it, I could imagine that kind of real estate, right? Nobody can
right.
imagine that kind of real estate
Yeah,
because of its wealth as far as resources. And it,
right.
it makes a difference. And so, yes, you can talk about Americans being hardworking and all of that kind of thing, and this is true, but you cannot diminish the fact that they're sitting on and looking at lots of wealth
Yes,
and
right. There's
resources.
lots of wealth and resources, and just some incredible, amazing features about the United States. When you think about the Mississippi River coming down through the middle of the country and all the tributaries that feed into the Mississippi River, and
Yeah.
then all of that farmland, that fertile land that exists around those tributaries and along the Mississippi River, and the ability to grow massive amounts of grain and to be able to immediately put that on barges and ship it right out to sea. Name me any place else in the world
Yeah.
that has that kind of geographic, setup. Particularly going back to the era before you had steamships and that kind of thing,
Yeah.
being able to move things. And you can go on with the number of natural ports that exist along our coastal lines that simply don't exist in other parts of the world. There's many features about North America that just made it geographically very advantageous. Yeah,
Yeah.
and yeah, I think it's clear from the beginning is the revolution, at least probably even before, you had this idea of the what later became the manifest destiny, that it was the
Yeah.
United States vision. I mean, Thomas Jefferson, the Louisiana Purchase. I mean, that they're thinking of it then. That's where all this is going.
Yeah.
And ironically, the issue with slavery was probably the thing that may have slowed it temporarily because of the expanding of states and not wanting to get an imbalance between slave states and free states and trying to manage that process that ultimately culminated in the Civil War. But yeah, I mean that vision of things, which the manifest destiny taking the continent. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, so get to the slavery. You mentioned that. So let's get to that. So this is
Yeah.
the narrator talks about the Stamp Act and anti-Stamp Act protesters. And the narrator states, in Charleston, South Carolina, white anti-Stamp Act protesters marched through the street chanting liberty. But when enslaved South Carolinians echoed their cries, frightened enslavers called out the militia to patrol the
Uh-huh.
street.
Yep.
So liberty
Yep.
doesn't apply to everybody. Now, some
Everybody.
saw this problem, right? There were
Yeah, I'm
some
sure they
then
did. Yeah.
who
Yeah.
saw this, others who, were found ways to, dismiss it, but there were those who were concerned about it. Um,
Right.
and al- Along with that, Stacy Schiff says part of our revolution, I think, we have largely sanitized. I think we have forgotten much of the street warfare of the anarchy of the provocations that took place. And we mentioned this at the beginning that we've got
Yeah.
communities divided by
Right.
slave and free,
Right.
Tory and patriot, all kinds of different divisions that are creating the problem. So one of the things along with that is that struck me, Michael, and I think this is really appropriate today,
Yeah.
is that there were certain places. They mentioned one town in South Carolina. I want to say Waxhaw, South Carolina, or Cowpens. I remember when I watched it, I said, "Oh, I've been there."
Yeah.
But
Yep.
where the British thought the way they were going to get the populace to submit is to, shock and awe, show their might,
Yes.
show their
Right.
force. And they went into these communities and did that, and they created enemies.
Yes.
And they
Yes.
talked about this one South Carolinian town, which had mostly Tory sympathizers, turned a lot of them against the British because they went in
Yes.
saying shock and awe, and the population will acquiesce, and it had the opposite effect.
Right.
People don't learn. Leadership don't
No.
doesn't learn. I mean, if you want to
No.
understand Minneapolis at the moment,
There you go.
you
Yeah.
need to take a look at what we've done. Every time we've done this in history, it doesn't work. People don't
Right.
like being bullied. People
Right.
don't like their neighbors being bullied,
Right. Yep.
and they are not going to. And there may be a few who acquiesce, but most are not.
Right.
And the British thought they were going to do this, and it never worked. And at some point, some 250 years later, we still think it's going to work.
Yeah. There's the what's the expression about you boil a frog in the pot slowly before they know they've been killed. That's that is the way it seems to me that those have been successful in
Yeah.
transforming and taking over places. It's the quiet, subtle, incremental uh, taking control of things is the way that they have ended up taking power and
Yeah.
holding power for any length of time. But it's so, it's not only American, but it seems to be distinctly American. This idea that we can go in with shock and awe and power and we'll just take
Yeah.
over um, always breeds resentment, breeds resistance, and it shocks people into reacting
Yeah.
to fighting that. The frog jumps out of the boiling water when you throw it a minute. I mean
Yeah.
that's the and it just amazes me that so many people like what we're seeing now with this administration, this idea that you can just suddenly slap people in the face and they're just going to say, "Oh, well, okay, we'll do what you say now." That is
Never
never.
worked.
You, it doesn't take much reading of history to know that almost never works.
Yeah.
You're right. That's what the British did. They just kept it just kept turning the heat up more and more in terms of the resistance. And had they been more conciliatory and developed a more conciliatory approach towards resolving some of the problems,
Yeah.
who knows? Who knows? We might still be part of the United Kingdom.
You never know.
Yeah.
There are days within the last several months where I've thought that might not be a bad thing. Uh, um, yeah.
Yeah.
The one thing too about mentioning this, because talk about shock and awe and everything, George Washington was one of the few persons at that time who really, really advocated and felt that it was important to treat prisoners of war humanely.
Yes, right.
You really didn't have any right. You don't have anything called a Geneva Convention. You don't have anything like this. Prisoners on these British ships, these prison barges, it was a mess full of disease. And
Yeah,
I'm not saying that in places the Americans treated the British any better, but Washington at least thought
yeah,
it was important to treat them humanely. And by the way, to give quarter to people who surrendered, right? That you
right,
didn't just go ahead
right.
and kill them anyway. So this is
Right.
an important point to make that Washington believed that mattered, that humanity to the enemy was
Yeah,
important. So
right. Exactly. Yeah.
yeah. So another thing to talk about in Revolution, I want to mention this because about newspapers and uh, people reading newspapers. Alan Taylor in the documentary says the colonial public is more literate than any other people in the world outside of Scandinavia. There's also word of mouth conversation, absolutely essential. So the colonists are big readers and they're reading
Yes.
newspapers and they really are literate. Now, the other thing that it leads to, though, um, uh, we have it today, partisan journalism that's
Right.
not overly concerned with accuracy. You know, Sam Adams, who had his own newspaper, um, he Adams, the narrator says, was a minister of propaganda. His mission, he once explained, was to keep the attention of my fellow citizens awake to their grievances. So, Sam, I
Yeah.
know a little bit about this because I've done some
Right.
reading on journalism in this time, and I mean, they just made
Yeah.
up stories.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Sam Adams
Yeah.
made up stories.
Yeah.
He made up a story about some British soldiers, generals raping some women, which was not true. Not that that didn't happen somewhere, but it was this story was
Yeah.
not true and caused a big stir and angered people up, and he was just making it up.
Yeah. But
So
and I actually think the period in which you and I grew up, and the period just before that was sort of the three major television networks, and you had New York Times and Wall Street Journal and a handful of major newspapers, and this idea that somehow they were committed towards trying to independently communicate truth. That is aberration in American history
yeah,
as opposed to the norm. You go back and look at some of these newspapers that have been around for 100 years ago, the Podunk Democrat, the so and so Republican,
yeah,
the such and such Independent.
yeah,
The towns had their partisan takes on these things, and we've had that all through American history. And so there's always been the need to ferret out the truth and to discern what is partisan rancor and what's truth. And I think we lived through a time where there was a greater commitment to that has diminished
yeah.
some in the recent years. But I think there are waves and patterns to that throughout history as well. But yeah, they this idea that somehow the things that we're experiencing are new. I think you go all the way back to the revolution, you can see just as bad, if not worse,
Yeah.
in terms of how
Yeah,
stories are made
yeah.
up.
Walter Cronkite is the exception to the
Yes,
rule. I mean,
exactly.
we
Yeah,
we say we
right.
want to go back to that good old time. Well, it is an old time, a previous time, but it wasn't the norm.
The norm.
It was the
Yeah,
aberration. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. One more comment I want to make here, and quote to talk about, and then that I think relates to today, and then see if there's anything we need to talk about from your end. But
yeah,
there's a quote here from one of the persons they interview, Serena Zabin, who says, and this is very appropriate today. An army
yeah,
during wartime makes sense. Of course, you need that. But an army during peacetime is a standing army. And if you have
yeah.
an army during peacetime, the thinking is that its only use is to turn on poor innocent subjects,
Yes, yes,
right?
exactly.
This is the
Yeah,
complaint in the Declaration of one of the complaints in the Declaration
sure it
of
is.
Independence that the king has quartered troops in our city.
Yes, exactly right.
And if you're
Yep,
quartering troops in our city in peacetime, who will bear the brunt of the actions of those troops? Because there's no enemy around,
right. They got to have something to do, right?
right? I mean,
There you go.
here we go again.
Yeah, national police force, and yeah, You're not supposed to. I mean, going back to the Declaration of Independence, and we look at our Constitution, the first five amendments to the Constitution. What is it we're being told today? You can't protest. Protesting is not allowed. That's subversive and terrorist activity. You can't bring a weapon to a protest, even if you legally own it and you got it concealed. You can't bring the weapon. Um, you don't get due process when you get arrested. We're just going to arrest you without a warrant and take you in, and we don't have to have probable cause to take you in. You go right down through the first five amendments of the Constitution, and
Yeah.
what you're seeing right now is just the blatant disregard of these four elements of our society.
Yeah, disregard and ignorance.
Yeah,
When you have people arguing that non-citizens are not entitled to due process when several Supreme Court rulings have said otherwise,
exactly.
right?
Yes, yes,
It's just ignorance too.
yeah,
And so it's just inconvenient and
yeah,
it's just maddening. But
right.
again, as I keep saying, history rhymes, right? It
Yes,
doesn't
it
repeat
does. Yeah,
itself, but it rhymes. And
right,
you can't find anything that's happening today that's unique.
right,
Um,
right,
there are forms in which this has happened in previous times and places. So, in other
right.
places, Michael, what do we need to? Anything that you took away from this? We need to have conversation about.
I think on the broader picture of the whole series put together and reflecting and thinking about that, you talked about how it truly was a civil war. It's also an international war.
Yeah.
Multiple entities from Spain to Great Britain to France to Native Americans to they're all there was this total mixture of things. So it's a very complicated war.
Mhm.
Um, and I think what you see is in the development of things, the people that participate, you see some great moments of human dignity and great aspirations and the attempt to create something better, but also by those same people and some of those same factions and same groups, just horrible things that were done. The tarring and feathering and killing of neighbors, wiping out entire Native American villages in New York and other places, just massacring people. Um, the flat, fast, and loose with the truth. It's a complicated story that does not lend itself to an easy moralistic tale. And I think that the piece that I pull from that is that's what human existence always is. There is no simple story to this. And I come back to the beginning words of the Constitution. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union.
Yeah.
The opposite of dysfunctional is not perfect. The opposite of dysfunctional is functional, which is not perfect. And we will never have a perfect country. We're never going to have a perfect society. And so the idea is how do we become more perfect? How do we become more functional? And I don't think that whether we're functional or whether we're healthy is measured by how we're doing at our best times.
Yeah.
It measures what happens when things begin to fall apart. Have we organized ourselves in such a way, put ourselves in such a way that when the virus attacks the body, that we have the antibodies to be able to repel that virus and regain health again. And so, from that standpoint, as we look at what's happening today with the country and how terrible things are, I think we can take some level of hope. I take more hope in the idea that I think the antibodies are there,
Yeah.
and that these occasional places in history where we dissolve into some chaos and injustice and that type of thing, um, that's when we're sick.
Yeah.
So, how do we do when we're sick? And can we get healthy again? And I think we can, and I think we will. But that was one of the things that as I watched that documentary, was to be reminded we're trying to form a more perfect union. We're not trying to achieve perfection, and we just have to struggle through as best we can with the light that God gives us to pursue the truth and create better justice, more perfect union.
Yeah. Yeah, and I love that language. I've actually written on that even when it was written, and you had slavery and you had the things that were happening that must be talked about. And the indigenous folks, Trail of Tears, these things
Right.
must be talked about, must be mentioned. But there was still this idea that there could be a more perfect union, that there we could, so that while freedom is not afforded to everybody in this time, the movement of history is of such that the idea that all should be free and equal spreads. And
Yes.
it's a work in
Planted the
progress.
seed.
It's a
Yep.
work in progress. I would argue right now that we've got forces that really don't see that progress as a more perfect union. That
Yes. Right.
their more
That's
perfect
right.
union is in the past,
Right.
right?
Right.
And
Right.
so when you see those beginning words in the Constitution, they're forward-looking words, right?
Right.
In order to form a more perfect union, we've got people that feel like the more perfect union is being lost.
Right.
And
Right.
that's what we're fighting right now. And I think this is very important. I think those are great words, Michael, and I think that's probably a great way to end the conversation. Just to say one
Yep.
quick thing for you to respond
Yeah.
to. You talked about it being involving the world, right? Spain and others and everything.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
pointed out in that documentary that the 13 colonies, the British had 26 colonies in
Yes.
the
Yeah.
Caribbean, and they were actually the more profitable, mostly because
Yeah.
of slavery, unfortunately.
Yes.
But that when push came to shove, if you're thinking in just dollars and cents and profit for the British Empire, it's the colonies in the Caribbean that are producing the wealth.
Right.
So it leads some interesting speculation if the British had said, they're not worth keeping,
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
right?
Right. Yeah.
What
Yeah.
might have happened a
Exactly.
little differently? We don't know.
Yeah. There's so many different. What happens if France decides not to become involved in
Yeah,
the way that France was involved? I mean, we were. The American Revolution was a subplot in the larger French and
yeah,
English battles that were going on. I'll just say one other piece in closing that has struck me is that you had the American Revolution. There was the slavery issue, and a lot of people are critical about the Constitution and the way that it enabled slavery, and rightfully so. A more perfect union would have abolished slavery. But I do think it's interesting, and the guy's name is escaping me. He was the vice president of the Confederacy during the Civil War
Oh,
at the beginning.
Alexander Stevens.
There you go. Yes, his cornerstone speech, where he writes in his speech that Jefferson and the founders falsely believed that these differences between race, that all this stuff would eventually dissipate and fall away, and that you would have people behaving equally. And he says, and what we now realize is that that was a false dream that
Yeah,
those founders had, and that the races are not equal, and that's why we have to have the white folks in charge and slavery. We have, his was the idea that they tried to form this more perfect union, and they did it on the wrong cornerstone.
yeah,
So we're going to do this new cornerstone, and in many ways, that's the parallel to what we're seeing today.
exactly right.
We tried to do the idea of equality, the civil rights movement, the idea that all people are equal, that women have rights, this type of thing. That was the false cornerstone. We have to try to go back and build back this white patriarchy, Christian nationalist um, cornerstone for our
Right,
country. And I
right.
think that loses. But
Yeah,
that's the parallels. You're talking about history rhymes. I mean, it's the same sort of rhyming that's going on. Yeah,
yeah. That's where we are,
yeah.
and we just
So,
keep
but there is hope.
pursuing. There is hope. I'm cautiously optimistic.
Yeah,
I just get a little depressed when I remember we let stupid people vote. I just,
yeah,
I don't know how else to say this. That sounds so
yeah,
awful, doesn't it? Elitist,
yeah.
but it's true.
Right, yeah. Right. Yep.
But it's
And
where
so
we
we have.
are. Anyway, we just keep
Yep.
going. Well, Michael,
Yeah.
thanks for this. This is good conversation. Um,
That's, yeah.
and we'll be back next month, back to something
Okay.
else that, we got all kinds of things coming up in 2026.
Oh my goodness.
The
Yes.
economy is gonna
Yeah.
somehow, it's not good. I don't know what's going on, but it's not going to last. So
Yeah.
if things keep
Yep.
going where they are and just other things that are on the horizon, anyway, we'll have lots to talk about. So
Yep.
thanks. Appreciate it. Hey,
All right.
folks, thanks for joining us. This is Faith Seeking Understanding. I'm Allan Bevere, and the patron saint of Faith Seeking Understanding is Anselm of Canterbury, who said, I do not understand in order to believe, but I believe in order to understand. And so, friends, keep seeking.